Winston Churchill was born into the privileged world of the British aristocracy on November 30, 1874. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a younger son of the 7th Duke of Marlborough, and his mother, Jenny Jerome, was the daughter of an American business tycoon, Leonard Jerome. Winston's childhood was not a particularly happy one. Like many Victorian parents, Lord and Lady Randolph Churchill were distant. The family nanny, Mrs. Everest, became a surrogate mother to Winston and his younger brother, John S. Churchill. After passing out of Sandhurst and gaining his commission in the 4th Hussars in February 1895, Churchill saw his first shots fired in anger during a semi-official expedition to Cuba later that year. He enjoyed the experience, which coincided with his 21st birthday. In 1897, Churchill saw more action on the northwest frontier of India, fighting against the Pathans. He rode his gray pony along the skirmish lines in full view of the enemy. "Foolish, perhaps," he told his mother, "but I play for high stakes, and given an audience, there is no act too daring and too noble." Churchill wrote about his experiences in his first book, The Story of the Malacan Field Force. He soon became an accomplished war reporter, getting paid large sums for stories he sent to the press, something which did not make him popular with his senior officers. Using his mother's influence, Churchill got himself assigned to Kitchener's army in Egypt. While fighting against the dervishes, he took part in the last great cavalry charge in English history, at the Battle of Omdurman in 1898. Churchill was first elected to Parliament in 1900, shortly before the death of Queen Victoria. He took his seat in the House of Commons as the Conservative member for Oldham in February 1901 and made his maiden speech 4 days later. But after only 4 years as a Conservative, he crossed the floor and joined the Liberals, making the flamboyant gesture of sitting next to one of the leading radicals, David Lloyd George. Churchill rose swiftly within the Liberal ranks and became a cabinet minister in 1908 and president of the Board of Trade. The chief setback of his career occurred in 1915 when, as First Lord of the Admiralty, he sent a naval force to the Dardanelles in an attempt to knock Turkey out of the war and to outflank Germany on a continental scale. The expedition was a disaster, and it marked the lowest point in Churchill's fortunes. However, Churchill could not be kept out of power for long, and Lloyd George, anxious to draw on his talents and to spike his critical guns, soon reappointed him to high office. Their relationship was not always a comfortable one, particularly when Churchill tried to involve Britain in a crusade against the Bolsheviks in Russia. After the Great War between 1922 and 1924, Churchill left the Liberal Party and, after some hesitation, rejoined the Conservatives. "Anyone could rat," he remarked complacently, but it took a certain ingenuity to re-rat. To his surprise, Churchill was appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer by Stanley Baldwin, an office in which he served from 1924 to 1929. He was an aboon, if increasingly anachronous figure, returning Britain to the gold standard and taking an aggressive part in opposing the general strike of 1926. After the Tories were defeated in 1929, Churchill fell out with Baldwin over the question of giving India further self-government. Churchill became more and more isolated in politics, and he found the experience of perpetual opposition deeply frustrating. He also made further blunders, notably by supporting King Edward VII during the abdication crisis of 1936. Largely as a consequence of such errors, people did not heed Churchill's dire warnings about the rise of Hitler and the hopelessness of the appeasement policy. After the Munich crisis, Churchill's prophecies were seen to be coming true, and when war broke out in September 1939, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain appointed him First Lord of the Admiralty. Nearly 25 years after he had left the post in pain and sorrow, the Navy sent out a signal to the fleet. Winston is back. For the first 9 months of the conflict, Churchill proved that he was, as Admiral Fisher had once said, a war man, and Chamberlain was not. Consequently, the failures of the Norwegian campaign were blamed on the Pacific Prime Minister rather than the belligerent First Lord. When Chamberlain resigned after criticisms in the House of Commons, Churchill became leader of a coalition government. The date was May 10, 1940. It was Churchill's, as well as Britain's, finest hour. When the German armies conquered France and Britain faced the Blitz, Churchill embodied his country's will to resist. His oratory proved an inspiration. When asked exactly what Churchill did to win the war, Clement Attlee, the Labour leader who served in the coalition government, replied, "Talk about it." Churchill talked, in public and recently in private, to the astonishment of his private secretary, Jacques Caville. He once spent an entire lunch addressing himself exclusively to the marmalade cat. Churchill devoted much of his energy to trying to persuade President Roosevelt to support him in the war. He wrote the president copious letters, established a strong personal relationship with him, and managed to get American help in the Atlantic. Where until 1943 Britain's lifeline to the New World was always under severe threat from German U-boats, despite Churchill's championship of Edward VIII, and despite his habit of arriving late for meetings with a neurotically punctual king at Buckingham Palace, he achieved good relations with George VI and his family. As Churchill tried to forge an alliance with the United States, Hitler made him the gift of another powerful ally, the Soviet Union. Despite his intense hatred of the communists, Churchill had no hesitation in sending aid to Russia and defending Stalin in public. "If Hitler invaded hell," he once remarked, "I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." In December 1941, 6 months after Hitler had invaded Russia, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The war had now become a global one, but with the might of America on the Allied side, there could be no doubt about its outcome. Churchill was jubilant, remarking when he heard the news of Pearl Harbor, "So we have one after all." However, America's entry into the war also caused Churchill problems. As he said, "The only thing worse than fighting a war with allies is fighting a war without them." At first, despite disasters such as the Japanese capture of Singapore early in 1942, Churchill was able to influence the Americans. He persuaded Roosevelt to fight Germany before Japan and to follow the British strategy of trying to slit open the soft underbelly of Europe. This involved the invasions of North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, the last of which proved to have a very well-armored belly. In June 1944, the Allies invaded Normandy, and the Americans were clearly in command. General Eisenhower pushed across northern Europe on a broad front, and Germany was crushed between this advance and the Russian steamroller. On May 8, 1945, Britain accepted Germany's surrender and celebrated victory in Europe Day. Churchill told a huge crowd in Whitehall, "This is your victory," and the people shouted, "No, it is yours." Churchill conducted them in the singing of "Land of Hope and Glory." That evening, he broadcast to the nation, urging the defeat of Japan and paying homage to the crown from all over the world. Churchill received telegrams of congratulations, and he himself was generous with plaudits, writing warmly to General de Gaulle, whom he regarded as an awkward ally, but a bastion against French communism. But although victory was widely celebrated throughout Britain, the war in the Far East had a further 3 months to run. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki finally brought the global conflict to a conclusion. But at the pinnacle of military victory, Churchill tasted the bitterness of political defeat. Churchill expected to win the election of 1945. Everything pointed to his victory, from the primitive opinion polls to the cartoons in newspapers and the adulation Churchill received during the campaign. But he did not conduct it well. Churchill was shocked by the scale of his defeat. When Clementine, who wanted him to retire from politics, said that it was perhaps a blessing in disguise, Churchill replied that the blessing was certainly very effectively disguised. For a time, he lapsed into depression, which sympathetic letters from friends did little to dispel. Soon, however, Churchill re-entered the political arena, taking an active part in political life from the opposition benches and broadcasting again to the nation after the victory over Japan. In defeat, Churchill had always been defiant, but in victory, he favored magnanimity. Within a couple of years, he was calling for a partnership between a spiritually great France and a spiritually great Germany as the basis for the recreation of the European family. He was more equivocal about Britain's role in his proposed United States of Europe, and while the embers of World War II were still warm, he announced the start of the Cold War at Fulton, Missouri in 1946. He pointed to the new threat posed by the Soviet Union and declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. Only by keeping the alliance between the English-speaking people strong, he maintained, could communist tyranny be resisted. He received the greatest state funeral given to a commoner since that of the Duke of Wellington. He was buried in Bladen Churchyard beside his parents and within sight of his birthplace, Blenheim Palace. And thank you for watching the video. Make sure to leave a comment so you can give us ideas for the video and help us improve. Also, make sure to leave a